In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. War, to quote an old song, is hell. It is brutal, it is ghastly, and in many ways exemplifies the worst that humanity is capable of. For the average citizen of the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium, however, war, and almost as importantly those who prosecute it, are the only things standing between him and annihilation. Whether that annihilation comes at the filthy claws of the Xenos, through the vile machinations of chaos, or the base treachery of the heretic. Only through constant vigilance and ceaseless violence, in the name of the God Emperor of mankind, can the human race survive. And for the bottom 99% of Imperial citizens, survival is the best they can hope for. The Imperium of Man can best be summed up as a galaxy-spanning theocratic oligarchy, comprised of various governmental departments, political factions, and aristocratic families, all vying for power, while sometimes, occasionally, acting in the best interests of the Imperium and seeking to further the will of the God Emperor. Or at least, what each faction thinks will further the will of the God Emperor. Unfortunately, the Emperor himself doesn't really have much of a say in the matter, given that he has spent the last 10,000 years in a state of almost death ever since his narrow and costly victory over the arch-traitor Horus Lupercal. As the average Chaos worshipper would say, the Emperor is little more than a moldering corpse on a gilded throne. Perhaps the best comparison to the Emperor of mankind would be the Emperor of Japan during the Shogunate. While the Japanese monarch was indeed the official political and spiritual leader of his people, he was ultimately little more than a figurehead, with real political power lying in the hands of the shogun. In the same vein, the emperor is technically the head of the government, while in reality the day-to-day workings of the Imperium are left in the hands of the Council of the High Lords of Terra. There is technically a larger governing body, the Senatorum Imperialis, but over the millennia, its power and relevancy has shrunk to almost nothing, and at this point it barely even meets anymore. The High Lords hold all the real power, and make all the real decisions. These decisions rarely, if ever, bode well for the average citizen of the Imperium, but then the Imperium of Man is more concerned with the collective survival of humanity as a species, and couldn't give a greenskin's fart about the survival, let alone the happiness, of individual human beings. And yet, despite its name and the fact that it controls more of the galaxy than any other faction, the government of the Imperium is oddly hands-off, though this is more due to the vast size of its dominion and the apathy of its leaders than any political philosophy of self-governance. In fact, as far as the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of clerks and bureaucrats that comprise the Adeptus Administratum, the Imperium's civil service, are concerned, any world in Imperial space can do as it pleases, so long as its citizens remember to pray to the Emperor and pay their taxes. This lack of concern for the well-being of the average citizen extends to the local leadership as well. Each Imperial world is ruled with absolute authority by a planetary governor. In a galaxy-spanning empire, where communication is slow and unreliable at the best of times, the average planetary governor often acts independently of the central authorities on Terra, and essentially rules the world as he sees fit. Just like the High Lords of Terra, the majority of planetary governorships are held by members of the aristocracy. As a result, they are, almost without exception, obscenely rich, comically self-absorbed, and so inbred that a look at the average genealogy chart would have even the Habsburgs feeling a little queasy. If, however, you are one of the 99% of citizens within the Imperium of Man, and if you're lucky enough that your planet doesn't get invaded by either chaos or aliens, then you can expect a brutal and mercifully short life of endless toil and drudgery, whether that's working the produce fields of an agri-world or the Munitorum factories of an industrial hive world. If you are unlucky, not only are you a mere peon, an insignificant cog in the grand galaxy-spanning machine of the Imperium, then you are also one of those unfortunate souls unlucky enough to have been born a mutant. The Imperium in general, and the Church and Inquisition in particular, are deeply concerned with maintaining the purity of the human genome and take an extremely dim view of any significant deviations from baseline humanity. If you are unlucky enough to have been born some kind of genetic deviant, then your only hope is that your mutation is minor enough that it can either be ignored or, at worst, classify you as an abhuman, in which case you are reduced to little more than a slave and looked down on as literally subhuman by the rest of the Imperium, but that is infinitely preferable to simply being branded as a full-on mutant, in which case your life is forfeit, you are deemed a traitor and heretic simply by virtue of existing as you are, and the best you can hope for is a quick death at the hands of any local Imperial authorities or citizens. What makes this truly grimdark is not simply the forfeiture of anything resembling individual human rights in itself, but rather the fact that this is actually justified within the context of the 40K universe. Although it is not always the case, mutation is a well-known and common sign of chaos corruption. Tzeentch, the literal chaos god of change in particular, is especially fond of bestowing mutations as a form of blessing or sign of favor upon his devotees. And since there are few fates in 40K that are worse than having your entire planet and its population being corrupted and consumed by chaos demons, the Imperium in general, and the Inquisition in particular, has had no choice but to assume the hardline stance of, we just can't afford to take chances. That said, there are two noteworthy exceptions to this rule: navigators and psychers. In the 41st millennium, faster-than-light travel is only possible, with certain exceptions, by use of the warp, an alternate dimension formed from the emotions of sentient beings. And since this is a grim, dark universe full of misery, suffering, and despair, the warp is essentially a literal hell dimension, infested with actual demons and eldritch abominations straight out of Lovecraft. The only safe means of travel through the warp is with the use of navigators, mutant humans whose mutation manifests as a third eye in the middle of their forehead, which allows them to look into the warp and find the safest paths without going insane from the literal chaos constantly bombarding their senses. Like all mutants, navigators are mistrusted and barely tolerated, and yet, because of their essential role, navigator families, known collectively as the Navis Nobilitae, boast among their number some of the most influential and wealthy individuals in the entire Imperium of Man. Given all the obvious similarities between these and the navigators from Dune, it's pretty clear that the people at Games Workshop were big Frank Herbert fans. Then there are psychers, abhumans capable of all kinds of strange abilities, from telepathy and precognition to moving objects with their mind and shooting fireballs from their fingertips. If anything, psychers are even more mistrusted and hated than regular mutants. This is because in order to use their powers, a psyker has to open his or her mind up to the warp and then channel its unnatural power through them. Essentially, a psyker using its powers is like a walking hell portal through which the demons of the warp can use to break through into the material world and cause all kinds of havoc. One of the responsibilities of a planetary governor is to make sure that every person on his or her world that manifests psychic abilities is to be rounded up and detained. Some of these psychers are snapped up by the Imperial Guard, the Inquisition, or the Space Marines, because while an untrained psyker is a dangerous liability, a trained psyker can be a useful, albeit risky, asset in battle against the Imperium's myriad enemies. The rest are claimed by the ominous black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and transported directly to Holy Terra. There, in the Sanctorum Imperialis, at the foot of the Golden Throne itself, these psychers are rigorously tested. Those who pass are mentally conditioned into being astropaths, individuals capable of telepathically projecting information and messages via the warp, again without losing their sanity. The rest are plugged into the Golden Throne, and their psychic essence is used to sustain the Emperor, who in turn uses what little life force remains in his withered husk of a body to continuously project the Astronomicon, a powerful psychic beacon that functions as a lighthouse in the warp, which the navigators use to steer their ships by. Without the guidance of the navigators and the ability of the astropaths to maintain communication, the Imperium of Man would simply cease to exist as a cohesive entity. Only one other thing maintains the unity of the Imperium: the state religion known as the Imperial cult and the priesthood of the Adeptus Ministorum. This is especially ironic given that when the Emperor was properly alive, not only did he strenuously deny any claims to divinity, but also part of his original plan for the Imperium involved the stamping out of all forms of organized religion. No doubt if Big E was able to divert his attention from the Astronomicon and the Chaos Gods long enough to learn just how widespread the cult of his worship has become, he'd be spinning atop the Golden Throne. As for the Imperial Church itself, well, it is this strange, paradoxical combination of intolerance and open-mindedness. Allow me to explain. Obviously, freedom of worship does not exist in the Imperium of Man, and if anyone so much as even questions the divinity of the God Emperor or man's right to wipe out all aliens and rule the galaxy, that person will definitely be receiving a visit from their local unfriendly inquisitor. And if you do anything that even has the faintest whiff of chaos worship, odds are better than even that you will be burnt at the stake as a heretic. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. Heretics and traitors are actually executed by immolation in the 41st millennium. The concept of cruel and unusual punishment is completely meaningless for the Imperium of Man in general, and your average inquisitor in particular. On the flip side, while there is an orthodox way of worshipping the Emperor, one that the priests of the Ministorum try their best to edge Imperial citizens into following, they are surprisingly tolerant of the many thousands of different traditions and imperial cults that exist all across the Imperium of Man. It seems that the ecclesiarchy doesn't mind so much that distant citizens on distant worlds have different conceptions of the Emperor so long as they are worshipping the Emperor. For example, the inhabitants of a feral jungle world might conceive of the Emperor as a kind of primal forest god, while the inhabitants of a planet with a very long winter might worship the Emperor in the form of a solar deity, a bringer of life-giving light. There is, however, of course, one major exception to this rule, one form of Emperor worship that the ecclesiarchs are not too particularly fond of, and that is the cult Mechanicum, the religion of the Martian tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Make no mistake, the Mechanicus do venerate the Emperor, but not so much as a god, but more as a Jesus figure. The cult Mechanicum is built around the worship of an entity known as the Machine God, believed to be the source of all knowledge and motive force in the universe. The Emperor was the Omnissiah, a manifestation of the Machine God's will. Another thing that the Ministorum doesn't really like about the Mechanicus is that the Ministorum places a lot of emphasis upon the purity and beauty of the human form. While the Mechanicus doesn't dispute the idea of human supremacy, they also perceive flesh to be weak and fallible. As such, senior tech priests in particular have a habit of grafting bionic implants onto their bodies, even going so far as to having whole sections of their bodies replaced with mechanics. Not out of necessity, but in the belief that such augmentation will bring them closer to their god. Naturally, the Ministorum objects to such augmentations as the rejection of sacred humanity, but since the Mechanicus has a monopoly on weapons production and scientific development, they really can't afford to antagonize the Martian priesthood too much. The services provided by the Adeptus Mechanicus are especially important considering the fact that the Imperium of Man, despite being the largest and arguably most powerful faction in the 41st millennium, is locked in a constant struggle for survival against various alien races and the machinations of the ruinous powers of chaos. Fortunately for the Imperium, despite its lack of many desirable qualities, such as general prosperity, human rights, and even the most basic modicum of freedom, The one thing that it has never lacked for is men and women willing to sacrifice their lives in defense of the human race. There are the trillions of ordinary citizens that serve in the Imperial Guard, men and women who often must confront ravening hordes of aliens and demonic invasions with nothing more than las rifles, their faith in the Emperor, and sheer numbers. There is the Imperial Navy, which consists of entire fleets of vessels ranging from one-man starfighters to battleships as long as 10 kilometers, bristling with Gothic cathedral spires, macro cannons the size of skyscrapers, and laser batteries capable of reshaping whole continents. There are the fanatical battle sisters of the Adepta Sororitas, women trained from an early age to purge all traitors, mutants, and heretics in the God Emperor's name. For more subtle work, there are the peerless killers of the Officio Assassinorum, ranging from inhumanly precise snipers to masters of disguise to living anti-psychic weapons. The Adeptus Custodes, warriors tasked with the sacred purpose of protecting the Golden Throne and the physical person of the Emperor. The Adeptus Mechanicus also fields armies in the defense of humanity, from legions of lobotomized battle servitors to the elite cyborg infantry known as the Scitari to the earth-shaking war engines of the Legio Titanica. Finally, and most famously, there are the Space Marines of the Adeptus Astartes, genetically engineered super soldiers created from the genetic template of the Emperor himself and his 20 Primarchs. It all sounds very impressive, until you realize that the modern Imperium is but a shadow of what it used to be. The Imperium was brought to the brink of annihilation by the Horus Heresy, and it's never really recovered from it. Though it does maintain its position as the dominant military power in the galaxy, ever since the end of the Heresy, the Imperium has been slowly but surely declining and stagnating. More knowledge has been lost rather than gained, and the Imperium has become almost an inverse of everything that the Emperor had originally envisioned it to be, an empire of reason, enlightenment, and peace. Given that the Emperor was the most powerful and one of the most knowledgeable humans that have ever lived, though admittedly his humanity is something of a questionable issue, one does have to wonder, where did the plan go wrong? Why did the Great Crusade fail? In my opinion, the cause of the Emperor's plan failing can be boiled down to the Emperor being possessed of that most classical of heroic flaws, hubris. On paper, the Emperor's plan was a pretty solid and reliable one. Conquer the galaxy, eliminating all non-humans if possible. Unite humanity under a single banner, through diplomacy if possible but by force if necessary. Stamp out all organized religion in the name of the imperial truth, thus starving the chaos gods of their primary source of power. And finally, develop an alternative to warp travel, thus reducing the possibility of humanity being influenced by that dimension. Where I think the Emperor went wrong ultimately was his overconfidence that his plan would go off without a hitch. The possibility of failure doesn't seem to have ever occurred to him, and we certainly have no evidence that he ever planned any form of contingencies should the worst come to pass. This is especially the case with regards to the Emperor's so-called sons, the Primarchs, the very generals that he was relying on to do most of the conquering in his name. It's true that the Primarchs, as well as the Space Marine legions derived from their genetic templates, were superhuman beings capable of great good, but in turn, that also means they were equally capable of great evil. In the words of British author C.S. Lewis, you don't make devils from bad mice or fleas. To make devils, you need bad archangels. The Emperor seems to have failed to take into account the fact that Primarchs like Horus may well have been superhuman, but that also made them, well, human, with all the foibles and fallibilities that implies. The Emperor's hubris may have been the great flaw in his perfect plan, but what ultimately derailed the Great Crusade was the fact that 9 individuals, 9 superhumanly powerful individuals, fell to darkness. And so the galaxy burned in a fire that it still hasn't recovered from even 10,000 years later. Things only seem to have gotten worse for humanity in recent years. With the turning of the 42nd millennium, a great warp rift has now formed, splitting the galaxy in half, effectively severing half of the Imperium's population from its leadership on Terra and the guiding light of the Emperor's Astronomicon. The forces of chaos now seem more powerful than ever, and the numerous xenobreeds that threaten humanity have only seemed to grow in strength. And yet, amid all this darkness, there is one bright spark of hope. After 10,000 years, one of the loyal Primarchs has finally returned to the Imperium. He is determined to restore the Imperium to its former glory, and if a Primarch can't do it, then no one can. Don't be confused here. The Imperium is not the good guy of 40K. This is, after all, a grim, dark, and wholly relativistic universe. It just so happens that this huge, bloated, incredibly tyrannical system is humanity's best chance of survival. Whether or not the Imperium of Man will be able to survive in the coming years that follow will ultimately be decided by even greater powers, by which I mean the owners of Games Workshop and the authors at Black Library. For now, though, it's a great big universe in the 41st millennium, chock full of stories worth telling, though they will have to wait for another time. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.